Thank you, Amelia, for that very kind introduction. So she mentioned I was an undergrad here. I haven't been back for quite some time, and I remember the last time I was in one of these seminars, the Latin American study seminars, when I was an undergrad, and I saw Alfred Steppen give a talk on the politics of Brazil. So I'm excited for those of you who don't know, Alfred Steppen is one of the leading lights in the study of comparative politics and Brazilian politics. So I have very big shoes to fill. Okay, great. So the title of this paper is Buying Power, Electoral Strategy Before the Secret Vote. I thought to get us on the same page and realizing that many of you are not necessarily political scientists, I thought it would be helpful to give a sense of some of the intellectual background that's motivating this project. And I'll give you a sense of how this particular project fits in within the larger body of work that I'm conducting on Brazil. So if you set the time, if you set sort of the clock back 15 years or so, there's this really interesting moment in the study of comparative politics and the discipline of political science where we're kind of rediscovering the importance of clientelism as a force for mobilizing voters and developing democracies around the world. We had never really forgotten that clientelism was an important force. But with the paper by Susan Stokes and papers by Leonard Wanskishnon and the edited volume by Kitschelt and Wilkinson, the study of clientelism and vote buying became one of the core topics of the study of political behavior in comparative politics. The initial analytical treatments of this topic, though, were thin. And what I mean by that is the organizational structure that initial treatments of clientelism envisioned was pretty simplistic. So a variety of initial treatments thought of clientelism as a more or less direct, straightforward exchange between politicians or parties and voters on the other end. Okay? Over time, as scholars did more empirical work on the nature of clientelism, they found that this simplistic vision was wanting. And in particular, as the literature developed, more and more the scholarship turned its attention to the role of vote brokers, okay? Vote brokers are local intermediaries who mobilize blocks of voters on behalf of the politician or the political party that has contracted for their services. So now if you ask me today, what is kind of the dominant intellectual force within the study of clientelism? It is this work on vote brokerage. If you go to conferences where people are studying clientelism, I would suggest to you that the majority of papers are going to be papers on vote brokerage today. So in terms of my own work on this topic, for a number of years, I have a body of work that has been interested in the role of vote brokers in Brazilian politics, both in the contemporary period as well as historically, okay? And so I've focused on vote brokers in Brazil to address 4 questions. And these questions have all been intermingled with issues of vote secrecy. So one of the first questions that I addressed in this agenda was, are vote brokers still effective in mobilizing voters in contemporary Brazil in spite of the presence of a secret ballot? There was once an argument that the secret ballot should be deadly to clientelism and vote brokerage. Anybody who's not a political scientist want to take a gander at why that's the case? Why did scholars think the secret ballot was deadly for clientelism and vote brokerage? In the late 19th century United States, there were reformers who were pushing for the Australian ballot, particularly because they had this vision that it would kill machine politics, kill clientelism, kill the role of ward healers, right? It's because it creates a credible commitment problem, right? The idea is that if the vote is truly secret, then citizens can take the bribe from the ward healer, go into the polling station, vote their conscience, and as a consequence, there's no reason that buying someone's votes should actually produce electoral returns for the would-be vote buyer. Okay, so that was an important argument. It was first broached in this paper by Susan Stokes. And so it led to these studies of how and why vote brokers actually are still effective in mobilizing votes. I found that they were. Subsequent work looked at the explanation for the survival versus decay of vote brokerage under the secret ballot. And more recently, I have a series of studies that are looking historically at how did, in fact, the adoption of the effective secret vote affect the capacity of vote brokers to mobilize the vote, and more generally, how did the introduction of the secret vote affect the nature and quality of democratic engagement in Brazil. So this paper is the fourth in this series of papers, and here I'm looking at the following question. How does the labor market for vote brokers work? Okay. So here's the puzzle that motivates this particular paper. And we can think of it very simply as the selection puzzle, okay, right? So you take a politician in choosing to employ certain vote brokers versus others, right? The politician has to decide how he's going to make or how she's going to make costly investments, right? There's a lot of vote brokers that he or she could choose from, but the politician has a limited campaign fund. He has to work with some and not with others, right? So this is basically an investment problem, right? The politician has to choose the level of investment, if any, that he or she is going to make in each broker's political machine, okay? So it's often claimed in the literature that this is a process governed by learning, right? That politicians make their investments in brokers' machines as a function of what they have learned over consecutive election cycles about the intrinsic abilities of these brokers in mobilizing voters. Okay, that's an important argument out there in the literature. As it turns out, the evidence for this argument is actually pretty indirect at this point, and it's subject to significant debate. Okay. So what this paper does is the following. It utilizes a hand-coded data set based on the personal archives of a powerful mid-20th century Brazilian politician by the name of Gustavo Campanella. And this hand-coded data set allows the paper to do two things, right? It provides the first direct evidence of the importance of learning about brokerability for the investments that politicians make in brokers' machines. Moreover, the data set allows us to estimate the impact of investing money in brokers' machines on the votes that politicians receive. And to fast forward to what I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation, I estimate that by investing in brokers, Gustavo Campanella was able to get a return of about 1 vote per $14 in 1990 dollars. Okay, that's actually a really high level of electoral efficiency by historical standards and by comparative standards, right? So investing in vote brokers really worked for Gustavo Campanella during this period of time. And I'll describe to you why I think that's the case, okay? So let me talk a little bit more about the literature and then get into the structure of this paper. So as I said, there's a lot of work on vote brokers now in comparative politics. It is a hot issue area within the subfield of comparative politics. The vast majority of the literature has focused on the relationship between brokers and voters, okay? And it's asked basically the question, what is it that makes for an effective broker, right? Why are some brokers more effective than others in mobilizing voters? And the emphasis here in the literature has been on brokers' access to information about the material preferences of voters, brokers' ability to exploit the degree of economic vulnerability which is experienced by voters. There have been papers that focus on brokers' ability to access state resources, their ability to solve voters' problems, and more recently, a literature that suggests brokers are most effective when they're embedded in citizens' social networks. Okay. Another strand of the literature, which is going to be the strand that this paper contributes to, focuses on brokers' relationships with their patrons. Okay, and when I use the word patrons here, I'm referring to the politicians or the political parties that have contracted for their services. Okay. So this literature has historically focused on the problem of mitigating opportunism. So how can we write contracts that keep brokers from just taking the money of their patrons and then running, right, and not exerting effort on their behalf, right? How do we keep brokers from betraying their patrons, right? Then there's another part of this literature that focuses on the problem of selection by looking at the ability of politicians to select good types of brokers and not select bad types of brokers. And when I use the term good versus bad type of broker, I'm referring to differences in intrinsic ability, right? The idea that there's some brokers given a fixed amount of funds that are just going to be more effective in bringing voters out to the polls than others, okay? And so there's a variety of studies that focus on this learning mechanism that argue that politicians can use indicators such as aggregate vote tallies in brokers' jurisdictions, or even things like the participation of citizens in rallies as measures of brokers' type. And they can use these indicators to learn over time which brokers are effective and which brokers are not so effective in mobilizing voters. So there's been studies that have drawn on these types of metrics to make the argument that politicians learn about brokers' ability by utilizing these metrics in cases such as Argentina, Liberia, Mexico, and more recently, Senegal, okay? So a lot of studies suggest, okay, that politicians can learn about brokers' ability by using these metrics, okay? But none of those studies actually clinch the case for this learning mechanism. And they don't because they don't have a data set that is ideally suited for evaluating the importance of learning. I would submit to you that if we want to evaluate the importance of learning, we need a data set with three characteristics. One, it has to have initial expectations of brokers' performance. Two, the data set has to have measures of realized performance, and then ipso facto, the deviation between expectations and realized performance, which is going to be the basis of learning, okay? And then show how that deviation between the initial expectation and the realized performance translates into differences in investments in brokers' machines, okay? And again, my claim, I would submit to you that what makes this paper unique is it's the first paper to bring to bear a data set of this form to try to clinch the case for the importance of learning in driving investments in brokers and driving selection of brokers. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the context in which this study takes place. So forget about sort of the abstract discussion. This is Brazil in the late 1950s, early 1960s, right? During this period of time, for proportional representation elections, Brazil uses something called the cédula avulsa, okay, which is a candidate printed ballot system, right? As opposed to the way in which we all vote today that you take for granted, which is an Australian ballot system, right? The ballot paper that you use is an invention, right? People did not used to vote that way, right? Prior to the invention of this uniform ballot that you get in the polling station from electoral authorities that gives you the ability to vote for anyone that's been registered in your district. In Brazil and in the United States, you had a system where either candidates or parties distributed ballots to voters through intermediaries, and those ballots could only be used to cast a vote for that particular candidate or for that particular party. Okay, so that's the nature of the electoral world that I'm studying in this paper. Okay, so in this setting, candidates for federal and state office in Brazil often made deals with vote brokers. Okay, and the vote brokers that we're looking at here, many of them are mayors, and many of them are presidents of the municipal directorate of the party to which Gustavo Campanella belongs, okay? If you think about sort of sociologically how these people fit in, many of them are landowners or the descendants of landowners that come from influential families in the state of Minas Gerais, okay? Here's the key. Under this old candidate printed ballot system, if you didn't have a broker, right, in a particular municipality distributing your ballots, you knew how many votes you were going to get, right? How many votes were you going to get? You were going to get 0 votes unless you had a broker, right? Because voters didn't have any way to vote for you, even if they wanted to, at least not in rural areas, right? So this type of system made interactions with brokers absolutely essential, right, for mobilizing the vote. Moreover, it made it very easy for politicians to hold brokers accountable, right? Politicians could easily evaluate brokers simply by looking at the number of votes that they mobilized, examining vote tallies at the level of the municipality, because these brokers were ensconced in particular municipalities, okay? So this is a visual depiction of how people actually voted. So this is the type of ballot that citizens utilized to vote during this period of time. So this is the ballot that Gustavo Campanella utilized for the federal deputy elections in 1954. All ballots, all of the candidate printed ballots had to basically have this structure: the name of the office that the candidate was running for, the name of the candidate, and the party that the candidate represented. Okay, so these ballots would be distributed to voters by brokers or by brokers' ward healers. In Brazil, they were referred to as cabos eleitorais. So let me tell you a little bit about Gustavo Campanella and the papers that motivate and form the basis of this study. So a really influential legislator from Minas Gerais. He was federal deputy from 1945 to 1970, winning re-election 6 times consecutively. So an extraordinarily successful politician by Brazilian standards or any standards. He was also a leading member of the PSD party, the Social Democratic Party, which is a total misnomer. It was not a Social Democratic Party. It was a right-leaning party that was strongest in the rural areas of Brazil where these local bosses were operative, okay? It was primarily a party that was dominant in the countryside. So Campanella's election papers, I think, are really a gold mine. They're extremely exciting for students of clientelism, and one of the reasons is that they run thousands of pages, and they include letters, telegrams, notes that capture interactions between Campanella, his brokers in various municipalities in Minas Gerais, and members of his campaign staff. For those of you who are interested, they're held at CPDOC, which is in the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Rio de Janeiro, which is the best political archive in Brazil. And more to the point, as I'll explain to you in a moment, one of the things that I think is really exciting about the Campanella papers is they contain detailed tables with records of electoral expenditures at the municipal level on different brokers over 2 electoral cycles, okay? And they also contain records of Campanella's vote tallies and expectations about vote tallies over multiple electoral cycles. So let me talk you through some of the evidence on the nature of exchange during this time period. In some cases, it was brutally direct. So this comes from a letter that was sent to Gustavo Campanella before the 1958 elections from a campaign worker, okay? So the campaign worker was going across different municipalities in Minas Gerais, and he was trying to find mayors that didn't yet have a compromise, which meant that mayors had not yet pledged to work as a broker for a particular federal deputy politician. So this campaign worker summarized the situation in 6 different municipalities where mayors were potentially open to compromises with Gustavo Campanella. And here's sort of a typical entry, right? Where the campaign worker says, look, the mayor, Sebastião Costa e Silva, and Mr. Rafael Gisimoni, who run the PSD in Gloria, guarantee 200 votes. The parties there have formed a coalition. There's only one candidate for mayor. Mr. Sebastião Costa e Silva requests a financial contribution, uma ajuda financiera, if that's possible. If you're favorably inclined, send a check via Banco Itaú to the branch in São João Batista da Glória, okay? September 24th, 1958. You go a few pages further, okay, in the electoral archive, what do you find? So next to this entry on the page, Gustavo Campanella writes down 20,000. On another municipality, he writes down 50,000, and that means that he was going to pay off this guy 20,000 cruceros. And in that other municipality, the mayor 50,000 cruceros. How do we know for sure that that's the case? A few pages later in the archive, he actually kept the receipt, okay, for the bank deposit, written out, to Banco Ito in the name of the mayor who's going to get it, okay? So this is not an uncontroversial interpretation of what these exchanges actually represented. It's pretty dispositive in my mind, okay? So the data that I'm going to look at, part of it is going to be based on expenditures on vote brokers. And I'm using, for the 58 and 62 elections, these tables that Campanella created, recording his expenditures on the municipal machines of brokers. So you have the name of the municipality, the individual to whom the money was sent, the check number, and the amount of money that was sent for each municipality in Minas Gerais where Gustavo Campanella had some type of exchange or agreement, okay? And that's going to be the basis of the spending data I use in this paper. In terms of expectations and actual votes, something that is really cool, and I've never seen this out there in sort of the empirical world, is that for 3 different electoral cycles, Campanella created tables recording both his expected votes and his actual votes, and then the difference between them, right, for every municipality in Minas Gerais, focusing on those municipalities where he had an agreement. So the municipalities where he had some intervention and agreement are the ones that are circled. These numbers refer to annotated notes where sometimes he would describe what was going on there. On one line, you have previsão, how much he predicts he's going to get, and then apuração, how much he actually got, and the differences between those, okay? And so this data is going to be the basis of my electoral data. And I'm going to use, in particular, the deviations from expectations as my indicator of learning, okay, and how important learning is. All right, so here you get a sense of, this is just sort of a descriptive statistics graph here of the distribution of Campanella's raw votes across municipalities over time in Minas Gerais. And I just want to make 2 points with this, okay? The first point is that the modal amount of votes that Campanella got, or any politician would get across municipalities in Minas Gerais, is 0, right? Because you can't possibly afford to have a deal with every broker in every municipality in the state the size of Minas Gerais, right? There's almost 500 municipalities. So you have to pick and choose. And again, because of the nature of electoral technology, if you don't have somebody there representing you, you're just not getting votes, okay? The other thing I want to bring to your attention is how the volatility in votes across municipalities over time reflects the fact that this is an electoral context in which vote brokerage is dominant, right? You can't explain the fact that you go from like 1,000 or more votes in one municipality in one election to 0 in the next, to 1,000 in the next, right? Or go from 0 to 1,000 and back again, based upon a reputation for constituency service, or based upon some type of ideological proximity to the candidate. If those things were really driving votes, these changes should be a lot smoother than they are. But these changes are discontinuous and pretty radical, and that is consistent with brokers being sort of the dominant force in mobilizing votes. Okay, let me quickly go through the theoretical framework which undergirds this study. It's actually pretty important because it's going to produce 2 very specific expectations that I'm able to assess with the data in this period, right? So to organize my thinking about how investments in vote brokers work, what this paper does is it utilizes a 2-period principal agent model with incomplete contracts. And what incomplete contracts means here is just that the politician is going to make the payments to brokers up front, okay? I'm not paying you based on the number of votes you get ex post. I have to pay you up front, okay? And I think that makes sense in this context because politicians like Gustavo Campanella needed to pay these vote brokers for a lot of things. They needed to pay for transportation to mobilize voters to the polls, Sometimes they needed to rent out warehouses to house voters right before the day of the election. They needed to pay all of these cabos electorales, these local ward healers, to bring voters to the polls. So you needed to give money to these brokers up front, not ex post. Okay. So in the model, you have a politician. He employs 2 vote brokers. Each of the brokers are solely responsible for mobilizing votes for the politician in their jurisdiction. And in each period, the politician's votes in a jurisdiction are a function of his payment to the broker, right? The more you invest in a broker's machines, the more the broker can create votes for you. But it's also a function of the broker's effort, the broker's ability, and random noise. And the key point here is the politician doesn't observe broker's effort or broker's ability directly. Okay, he needs to infer those things from the realized number of votes that are produced in each jurisdiction. So what's going to happen in the model is the vote brokers are going to exert a lot of effort to try to convince the politician that they're of high ability. Okay, and that's going to convince the politician that the politician should invest more resources in them in the future. So 2 comparative statics are going to come from this model. I think they're both fairly intuitive, especially the first, right? The first I refer to as the optimal recalibration of campaign spending, right? It just means that vote brokers who do better than you expected will get more resources in the future because you've learned that they're of higher ability than you thought initially, right? And the opposite is also true, right? Vote brokers who underperform expectations are going to get fewer resources in the future because you've learned that they have less ability than you expected. The second comparative static is a little bit more subtle. I refer to it as reputational conditionality. It's kind of like a don't throw the baby out with the bathwater finding, which is the elasticity of future payments to current deviations from expectations is going to be weaker for a broker for whom the politician has favorable beliefs than for a broker for whom a politician has poor beliefs, right? So if you have a broker who's been a real vote getter for you in the past and he has a record of getting the votes out for you in the past, if he underperformed expectations just in the last election, the effect that that underperformance is going to have will not be as great as for a broker who hasn't been successful in getting votes out for you in the past, right? That's also pretty intuitive, right? One bad finding isn't going to be the death knell for a broker who has a history of success. Okay, so how do I actually test these arguments? Very simple structure for the empirics. My outcome is going to be the change in spending in a given municipality from the election of 1958 to the election of 1962. Those are the 2 elections where I have data on spending. I run a simple non-interactive linear model and then an interactive linear model. The key variable that I'm looking at here is D, which is going to be the deviation between actual and expected votes in 1958. But I'm also going to run an interactive model where I interact the effect of that deviation with the number of votes that Campanella received in 1954. And the idea here is that that number of votes is a proxy for sort of the initial belief about the broker's ability, where I believe that brokers where I believe that brokers have high ability because they were successful for me in the past, the effect of that deviation should not be as strong. Okay. And then I'm going to condition on a set of political and demographic covariates, right? So the 2 expectations spelled out in clear empirical terms is that the coefficient on the deviation should be positive, right? Brokers that get more votes than you expected should be rewarded in future elections. Those who get less should be punished. But that the effect of that deviation should be conditioned by the prior number of votes that the broker got for you, okay? And indeed, if you go to the findings, both of those expectations met with confirmation in all of the empirical analyses that I conducted. So I conducted empirical analyses where I was looking at changes in proportion of total spending across municipalities, as well as changes in the raw spending across municipalities. The results were consistent to that difference in the measurement of the dependent variable. Across the board, the deviation variable was positive and statistically significant by any conventional standard. So these are t-statistics in parenthesis. Moreover, the interaction effect, as I expected, was negatively signed across the board and statistically significant by conventional standards. Okay. If you break down the impact of deviations from expectations by Campanema's votes in 1954, you find, as expected, that in areas where Campanella had low support in 1954, the impact of deviations in 1958, which was the dark black line, is quite strong. But in those places where he had high support already in 1954, the impact of a deviation in 1958 wasn't nearly as large or as relevant, right? Which is consistent with this idea of reputational conditionality. Okay, so all of this, all of these findings at this point, I think sort of beg the question of how much did this matter, electorally speaking, right? So we know at this point that Campanella was using resources efficiently, right? And utilizing information in an efficient way to make a decision about who he was going to invest in and who he wasn't going to invest in. It suggests, but doesn't prove, that money was important in driving votes, right? It suggests, but doesn't prove, that spending money on vote brokers was a way to really drive up your vote counts. Well, so this paper tries to test that proposition directly, and it uses a first difference approach to estimate the return to spending on brokers, right? So I look, my outcome here is the overtime difference in Campanella's votes in a given municipality from 1958 to 1962, and I use as the explanatory variable the difference in his raw spending in that municipality, again, from 1958 to 1962. So I'm looking at differences on differences. So if there's fixed characteristics of municipalities that you think are relevant here, potentially in explaining spending that might explain votes for Campanella, those are being washed away by the differences in differences. I also condition on a wide set of political and demographic covariates, and the analysis uses something called placebo tests to examine whether prior vote shifts were associated with changes in spending. The point of that is it helps to test whether or not the assumptions that undergird this empirical analysis, that undergird the causal interpretation of this empirical analysis, are valid. And I have no reason to believe that those assumptions are not valid based on this analysis. So to make a long story short, spending on vote brokers actually was extremely relevant in terms of predicting changes in Campanella's votes. And indeed, they suggest that by spending on vote brokers, Campanella was able to generate a high level of productivity in electoral expenditures. How high? Basically, he was able to get 25 votes for each 10,000 crucedos spent during this period of time, which, as I described at the beginning of my presentation, is roughly akin to one vote for every $14 US in 1990. To give you sort of a historical frame of reference, Christopher Cam, looking at vote buying in Great Britain just prior to the introduction of the secret ballot in the late 19th century there, suggests that votes cost about £4 on average, which would be equal to almost $300 per vote, right, in 1990 dollars. In the contemporary US, door-to-door canvassing is widely recognized as the most efficient way of using money to drive up votes. But even using that highly efficient strategy for driving up votes, the best estimates suggest that it still costs about $47 per vote if you use door-to-door canvassing, right? Which is orders of magnitude less efficient than what Campanella was able to get using these vote brokers, right? General campaign expenditures today, we think, net you about $145 per vote in the US, right? So $14 per vote actually looks pretty good, pretty decent bang for his buck. So to me, in my mind, what this suggests is that the high returns to spending do indicate that Campanella's brokers were really exerting effort on his behalf. They weren't just taking the money and running. The fact that their reputation was crucial to whether or not Campanella would spend on them in the future was leading them to really try to work for him and drive up votes. So this idea that reputation building can be a mechanism for accountability of brokers to politicians is one that does seem to meet with a substantial amount of evidence, at least in this data set that I'm looking at here. So let me conclude. We typically think of Brazil, based on the work of Scott Mainwaring, as being a context in which parties are fairly weak. If we think about Brazil that way, there's actually a debate about that. I'm not going to wade into that larger debate here, but if we think about Brazilian parties as being fairly weak, this paper shows that even in contexts of party weakness, brokers can serve as pretty effective intermediaries for their patrons, okay? And two factors contribute to the efficacy of brokers in this particular context, which are worth bearing in mind. One, there were really clear performance metrics because of the nature of the electoral system, because of the nature of this candidate printed ballot system. It was really easy for you to know whether or not a broker had a high ability. You could just look at the vote tallies in the municipality that broker controlled, okay? Two, and this was really crucial, and this differs across politicians, Gustavo Campanella had a long-term political career. He had a long-term reputation in the state of Minas Gerais. He was a very powerful figure, right? He was the former Minister of Education and Public Health for many years for Getulio Vargas. He was the intervener in the state of Minas Gerais for a period when Getulio Vargas was dictator. He was going to be there for a long time. So those brokers who were transacting with him knew it really mattered to establish a reputation with this guy, right? He was not a fly-by-night candidate, okay? So it was the combination of these factors that generated the reputational accountability I find here. And thinking about, external validity and sort of the generalizing the results that I find here for Campanella and Brazil, I think we're probably especially likely to find similar dynamics in polities where there are political dynasties, right, which have been established for a variety of countries, including India, Pakistan. In settings where reputations are transmitted intergenerationally, those time horizons are likely to be especially long, and these reputational dynamics are likely to be especially important, okay? All right, so with that, I'm gonna finish my talk. Love your questions or comments. Yeah, Ken.
Let me start. I find this data extraordinary, sort of the level of record keeping that took place around this kind of brokerage, and it just raises in my mind the puzzle of, was this considered acceptable? This is the norm? Was it legal? Was there, is there no effort to criticize this in that day and time, or was this just so accepted that you would actually keep this kind of records in terms of money being spent and everything? And then sort of related to that, I'm very curious about the relationship between the brokers and, Campanella and this machine. And are brokers, really free agents? Are they free to go work for another patron, or is Campanella is sort of the only guy in town, so they have no choice but to work with him. And then they're competing with each other. So I guess the question then, is the central machine, having to, can they play one off against another?
Yeah.
Are they having to compete with other rival machines in order to try to get the best brokers? But what's the nature of those competitive dynamics?
Both great questions. In terms of norms and popular opinion first about this type of activity and why he would have kept these records. At this particular time in rural areas of Brazil, cultivating brokers was sort of the norm in terms of how you mobilize votes, okay? It was not uncontroversial. And I stated for the background of all of this is my research on the introduction of the cédula oficial, which was the secret ballot in Brazil, the official ballot in Brazil. A big part of the conversation about introducing that change in electoral technology was based on a push by other right parties, in particular the UDN, to try to eliminate this behavior and eliminate the power of vote brokers because they believed it benefited the PSD, relatively speaking, more than it benefited them, because the PSD was the largest party. It had all of these different municipal directorates throughout all of Brazil, and it controlled, had deals with more of these local bosses, okay? And they didn't like it. So all throughout this period, there are parliamentary debates and news articles speaking very, very poorly about precisely this type of activity. It was still the norm. It was still the way politicians did politics. It wasn't illegal, but we were at the cusp of an attitude change here, okay? So things were starting to change, and that was in part why you get this push for the official ballot, okay? The UDN was pushing for the official ballot because it was going to disenfranchise illiterates, and the illiterates were the majority of the voters who were being brought out to the polls by these local bosses, okay? It was part of that story. Campanella knew that, by the way, so one of the fun parts of doing this archival research is in 1966, this is during the military government was going to continue the implementation of the Australian ballot. So according to the electoral rules of 1965, it should have gone into power. The Australian ballot should have been implemented everywhere in that year for all different types of elections. The military government, based upon consulting with people who used to belong to the PSD and the UDN, now obviously they're in Arena, found out that a lot of the local power brokers didn't want the Australian ballot for them, for the constituencies that they interacted with. So they created this rule where the Australian ballot would go into force for municipalities over 100,000 inhabitants, but not for the small ones under 100,000 inhabitants. So one of the municipalities where Campanella was relevant was a municipality, I guess, at the cusp of that 100,000 threshold. It was categorized by the Brazilian Statistical Service as having over 100,000 inhabitants. So he wrote on sort of his paper, his own stationery as a federal deputy in Brazil, a letter to the Supreme Electoral Tribunal protesting that decision to categorize this municipality as having 100,000 inhabitants. And then he gave it to the mayor of that municipality, who then submitted it as if it was his own letter, right? You know that in the archives because the original letter is written in Campanella's handwriting, right? So he didn't like that change for precisely the reasons I articulated. I think he was as successful as he was for as long as he was because he kept these detailed records and used them, right? And so let me quickly get at the second question, which was what's the second question?
Whether or not Campanella could pick between different brokers and play one against another, were they competing with or the brokers, did they sort of have those rights because there were other rival machines and they could play one off against another?
Brokers could choose. What I have to say is I was surprised by how constraining party was actually in this setting. So the traditional view that Brazilian parties don't mean anything, that's not true here. Like Campanella is working strictly within the PSD apparatus, right? So the brokers were the municipal directorate presidents or the mayors of the PSD in a particular municipality. So it's not like you couldn't easily go to another broker within a particular municipality. The choice was across municipalities in Minas Gerais. But brokers could go with other politicians, right? They could support Gustavo Campanella, or they could support somebody else in the PSD, of whom there were many candidates at any given time. Right? But not to Campanella. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the second question that Ken made, so I had a question about the type of broker matter. Like if it was part of. So you mentioned that most of them were mayors,
or municipal directorate presidents. From the evidence that I'm able to glean, I can't say that systematically, but when there are these exchanges and people's position is being mentioned, that's what comes up the most commonly.
Is there a possibility that there's like a different effect, but or level of effect by the type of broker? involved? Like if it was like a major or a municipal director, like, so that was one. And the second one was, so I don't particularly understand the sort of like the way in which the administrative sort of organization of Brazil, but I would imagine that those brokers worked also for not only diputados, but also senators or like other types of politicians. And like their efficiency in providing votes could also, to those other politicians, could also affect the Capanema's like ability to sort of calculate the amount of money that it's going to give to a certain broker.
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly, that's potentially true. So these brokers, I don't, there's not a huge amount of evidence for senatorial contests, but there's no reason why they wouldn't be bringing out the vote also for senatorial candidates. What I would say for the senatorial candidates, the need was less acute because you only have one or maybe two Senate candidates from a given party running in any given election in Brazil. So for the proportional representation elections, you have open list proportional representation. Okay, so you can have many, many, many candidates running for the same office in the same state, which is why you get this competition between Campanella and other members of his political party. But for the Senate, you're not going to have that, okay? And for the gubernatorial elections, you're not going to have that. So if party matters at all, right, and these brokers are working primarily for their party, then they don't really have a huge amount of choice. In order to choose between candidates, they do have to defect their party, right? And it's a bit more costly. So I am not saying that brokers didn't matter in gubernatorial elections or senatorial elections. I know they did, and I know there are brokers that defected their party, and that happened. But they didn't matter as systematically as they did for federal deputy contests, where they could keep their party label, they could use all the party structures at the local level, and just choose between one of the many candidates running for election. Yep.
Could you just go back to the maps, the slides for the maps? Well, actually, first thing, I was wondering if you could just like kind of talk more about like how the organizational process works. So how do they hand out these ballots? And like, was it only on the election day, or like, were they using other kind of like I don't know, organizational vessels like churches or something to hand out these ballots?
No.
And then about the maps, I was wondering if there's any logic to like when they choose or how or which areas they choose to target with these brokers. So like in the maps, there's certain areas that like in one election they pop up, and then in the next election they're kind of gone.
Yeah.
So what is the process? What is the logic behind like choosing like the northern part of Minas Gerais, like in 1954 versus not doing that?
Yeah.
And like also, well, you're talking a lot about political learning as like individuals, but what about across? So like people are obviously observing him doing this, and like how does that shape the process of their kind of behavior as well?
So let me just clarify the last. Yeah, so the last question is how does the knowledge that he's using brokers this way affect how other citizens are voting?
Other politicians.
Oh, okay. How other politicians?
It's like a kind of a more complex thing too. It's like so they see
Capanella, yeah.
Do certain like these strategies, and he's very successful. So do they start mimicking him in certain ways, or like do they start like doing similar things as well?
Got it. The first question was what does this look like on the ground in terms of the mobilization of voters? So there's kind of a literature from this period of time which describes the electoral process in Minas Gerais, and it uses this term called electoral quartels, quartéis eleitorais. And what's described in this work is essentially what vote brokers do local mayors do is they have their ward healers transport voters from rural areas of the municipality into the more urban component of the municipality a day or 2 days before the election. And then they rent out a space, and they physically confine them, and they provide them with food and drink and entertainment, and it's kind of a party. And then the day of the election, they march them out and give them their ballots. Okay. Sometimes, if there are multiple offices up for grabs, what they would do is they have people fold all of the different ballots they want them to vote, and they put them into an envelope, and they give the voters the envelopes as they're being marched to the polls. Okay. And the idea there is that if you've controlled access to ballots and physical transportation to the polls, now you know without error how these individuals are going to vote. There's an apocryphal story that I love to tell, which sort of illustrates that point. I had a picture here of earlier on in my slides of this guy, Chico Heraclio. He was the guy holding the gun. He was sort of one of the most notorious bosses of northeastern Brazil. And there's a story about Chico. It's too cute by half to be true, but it sort of illustrates this point, where he's doing this. He has his people give all the voters the ballots and envelopes, and they all go and they vote the way that he directed. And one gets out of the polling station and says, boss, we did what you told us. We, put all the ballots in the urn, everything direitinho, right? Just like you said. Can you do me one favor? Can you tell me who I voted for? And then Chico Heraclio puts his arm around the guy and says, son, don't ever ask me such an obscene question again. Don't you know the vote is secret? Again, too cute to be true, but it gives a sense of how this type of mobilization occurred. In terms of the spatial dynamics, I'll be frank. I wasn't able to find a lot of direct evidence of spatial strategies or spatial considerations in the data. I mean, so, Gustavo Campanella, he has like his hometown. I would imagine sort of, the proximity to the hometown is one relevant component, right? Which is sort of around here, which is why, there is some steadiness in that particular area and the other ones move away. Another thing to consider, which I haven't yet, is just like transportation costs. So these ballots have to be physically transported, either by truck or even by plane, to these different areas to be given to these vote brokers. And expenditures on the ballots themselves were not trivial. All candidates had to pay for this. It might be the case that politicians wanted to group their votes, right, to try to reduce those transportation expenditures as much as possible. I don't know that that's a fact, but it seems reasonable to speculate. Yeah.
So, first, thank you for the lecture. It's more a comment than a question. It's about the shift between the years.
Yeah.
The voters that, back in my city, I'm from Brazil. We have this history that, we have three families, and the three families were from different parties. UDM, PSD, and PTB. And each year of election, one family kills another, another chief of the family, and
figuratively, I hope.
No kill.
Literally.
Yes, literally.
Okay.
Yes. And it's common in Brazil, in the inner states and the inner cities, because the ability to classify the states. When Gustavo Vargas took the power, he appointed the governors in each
Sure.
state, and in Minas Gerais was easier because he had the power of the two parties that he created.
Yeah.
It was PTB and PSD. And the UDM in the early was not so strong.
Yeah.
And Gustavo Campanella was strong enough to pacify and things like that. But I think one of the explanations of this shift is this killing perspective of each politician or each broker. In Brazil we have Pedro In Goiás, we have Pedro Ludovico, that in order to avoid someone to rise up and took his place, he killed another families. And they maintain this process of, killing and disrupting and taking everything that those families have. In my city, we have the same.
What's the municipality?
Catalão, it's close to Minas Gerais.
Okay.
It's the state of Goiás.
Okay.
It's very close. And we have this history that one family, right before the elections occurred, they kill all the other families, and they took their houses, and they said to the people, now we rule here. And they took all their buses and the transportation of those families and take everyone from the rural areas to vote. So in Goiás, in the west of Brazil, the north of Brazil, it's happened a lot. I think it's a kind of explanation that can.
Well, one thing that it helps explain is why does it tend to be, and I get pushed on this actually a lot, is why does it tend to be that there's a single broker representing a municipality, right? The story that you're telling is completely compatible with why there's a single broker representing a municipality at a particular point in time. Like, to be perfectly honest, there are plenty of case studies in the literature from this period of time, being written in the 1960s, that suggest that that's not always the case. Like, there are settings where there are competing families, and they don't necessarily kill each other. They'll one takes over the municipality and kicks out all of the employees and representatives of the other family. That for sure happens. But what you're describing to me seems pretty extreme. The outright liquidation, literal liquidation of opponents. But certainly the figurative liquidation, meaning removing their capacity to mobilize voters, is very common. And indeed, that would help explain why there's only going to be one person in a given municipality, certainly within a given party, that this guy is transacting with. That's pretty neat. Thanks for that story. Yeah.
Kind of keeping in mind the contemporary case of elections in South America, because obviously that's coming up in the news a lot. Do you still find, because although the vote is now secret, do you find that there are still politicians who engage in third parties or come up with ways in which to use their monetary or otherwise influence to engage voters to vote for them or mobilize voters to vote for them? Or has this secretization of the vote pretty much done away with these types of services?
Sadly, no. Sadly, there's plenty of evidence in the literature that clientelism and the exploitation of brokers is still alive and well. That being said, I wouldn't say that the change from the non-secret ballot, this candidate printed ballot system, to the official ballot system was meaningless. It probably reduced the efficiency of electoral expenditures, in part because vote brokers, their performance couldn't be as easily monitored, right? And the returns that they got from extra effort in terms of future payments would have been reduced because their ability to drive up votes after the introduction of the secret ballot would have been reduced. But that's a difference along, to paraphrase economists, along the intensive margin as opposed to the extensive margin. Meaning this practice continues, right? And it actually looks shockingly similar. So if you have the time and you look at the 2014 QJPS piece that I cited at the beginning of this presentation, it's looking at vote brokerage in Minas Gerais in 1998, okay? Using data that comes from a corruption scandal in which a governor is buying off people who had just run for state deputy positions and controlled different municipalities. It looks eerily similar to what I'm showing you now for late 1950s, early 1960s, right? And it's very much consistent actually with the type of story that Fran Hagopian tells about long-term continuity in clientelistic practices. in Brazil, but actually in particular in the state of Minas Gerais. So the short answer to your question is, indeed, there's a lot of continuity in practice, continuity in terms of who these people are, mayors or former mayors. I don't think it is quite as relevant today as it was in the past. I think in the past, as I showed you, if you didn't have a broker, you were getting basically zero. That's not true anymore.
I have a question about these mayors. So are they elected by the people in
Yes.
elections, or are they, so what's their role? And basically, do you think there's also some taking cues? I'm even thinking about this, the new piece that talks about 1998 elections, where it's about taking cues from an elite that is telling me who to vote, as opposed to organizing my vote, convincing me to, or forcing me to vote.
Yeah, so I have to be honest in terms of the data that I have in this paper. The data that I have in this paper is all about the interactions at the upper level between the politician and the brokers. I don't have any evidence of what the brokers are doing at the micro level with the citizens, right? There is a little bit of an anthropological literature, very small, but that is being written during the 50s and 60s, kind of contributing to this debate about whether Brazil should implement the effective secret vote, which kind of describes some of those mobilization practices that I mentioned in reference to the previous question. But that's descriptive. It is not something systematic. I have no reason to doubt that's the way that it looked. That modality of transporting voters to the polls, transporting them to warehouses or other public spaces where they could be entertained. That sounds right to me, but that's basically all we have.
And these mayors are elected by the people?
They are elected. They're elected. You have a period of time, which actually I'm thinking about analyzing in the future, during the military government, where mayors in cities that were deemed to be of strategic importance were no longer directly elected, became appointed. It'd be interesting. I'm thinking about looking at the long-term legacies of that, but not during this period of time. That came later.
I can ask one final question.
Yep.
So does this system, you mentioned about, the remarkable continuity in looking at patterns in the late 90s.
Yeah.
We often hear that, like in the northeast of Brazil, which is where traditional forms of patron clientelism are so powerful that in some ways this gets modernized with the rise of the PT and that some of the brokers shift from the conservative parties over to the PT under the influence of the new social policies and everything. Is that, how does the story play out if you bring it up into the more recent period under Lula, and with the expansion of a party on the left into these traditionally clientelistic state and local, political domains?
Well, one way of reading the basic structure of the allocation of resources under Bolsa Familia, and I think this is the right reading, was precisely to undermine these types of practices, right? These types of practices at their heart, although I don't have the micro analytics here about the relationship between the brokers and citizens, at their heart, they require brokers to have material resources which are of fundamental value to citizens. If they don't, then they can't be playing this mobilization role for their patrons. And the whole purpose of the structure of centralizing Bolsa Familia within the Ministry of Sustainable Development in Brazil and limiting the potential for input or control by local politicians was clearly to undermine this, right? Because this was the game of the right. This is the game of the traditional right parties. Again, going back way to 1940s, 1950s, before the PT was the gleam in anybody's eye. And they understood this. And that continued on to the 1890s when it was PFL doing the same thing in the Northeast. So it's clear to me that PT had this in mind, and that one of the things that the structure of Bolsa Familia was supposed to do was to make this less politically relevant. Yeah. Good. Thank you.